But let me ask you this. What moral guts do Africans, I'm talking about Caribbeans, what moral guts do we have to be demanding some form of reparatory justice when we ourselves were involved in selling our own people, as Manasseh?
But that's false. That's a false narrative. Moro, you're so respected. Don't repeat that anywhere.
Whenever I say my PENDREAM TV there, I see them yopo.
Memo bibiara kwaba eba PENDREAM TV. So we are new to the channel, subscribe to the channel, bell notification no. Na share ma afofra ensa enka bi comment section ho. Nowadays we adventure aba for the first time in a while. Andrew Ejapa Mesa through a massive support and answer will acknowledge President John Dramani Mahama for doing this thing. Yeah, ako viral. Both Africa and international. Ubia come once. Ede and President John Dramani Mahama. Ama Andrew Ejapa Mesa through a massive support and answer no acknowledgement. The whole details. Bro, our video
we should celebrate the role that His Excellency the President played. Kudos to him, but give credit where credit is due.
On that same issue, Andrew Ejapa Mesa acknowledged President John Dramani Mahama the efforts and the moves. Kwesi Prat Jr. Ato Nsembi Amane Manasseh Azure. Efa Nsembia Waka Afa the Reparatory Justice President John Dramani Mahama ACK on the slave trade. Kwesi Prat Jr. Afire Manasseh Azure. What you say? Manasseh Azure is speaking from a place of ignorance. And some way, ne esema hudo bi na yade besom ele kameho. Na yinkoti the detailed story from how Andrew Ejapa Mesa bought President John Dramani Mahama about for this mover. What take any affairs no Kwesi Prat messenger wato amane Manasseh Azure.
But let me ask you this. What moral guts do Africans, I'm talking about Caribbeans, what moral guts do we have to be demanding some form of reparatory justice when we ourselves were involved in selling our own people, as Manasseh?
But that's false. That's a false narrative. Moro, you're so respected. Don't repeat that anywhere.
No, it's out there. When I talk about
it is based on
it's out there.
Yes. I hope I'll have
in fact,
the
president has had to respond to this, and we'll play that video. And that's why I'm asking
so
you this
ignorant.
Matter. I'll bring you. Hold on. So I'm sure you've heard that question too, and the sort of backlash and the criticism that has greeted it. And that's why I'm asking you. Well, I want to start from there before you give me your general thoughts on the matter.
I don't think that there's any basis for that assertion.
Okay.
I've read some piece that I believe it's Kofi Benton who put out.
It was a back and forth between Manasseh and Kofi. Unbelievable. They debated it the whole day.
I didn't see the thread.
Yes.
His initial response that sought to distinguish between slavery and slave trade. Okay, where of course, you get a sense that, and of course, with all that Uncle Chris Senior has said, really and truly, the United Nations itself having acknowledged, in the light of all the background of the alleged African participation and all that, to arrive at the conclusion that this is the grievous crime against humanity, should put to bed the argument about what role our forebears played in all this activity. But I like how he put it. Okay, context is always important, and the politicking that our friends in the NDC sought to play with this whole reparations thing, I guess that in the spirit of nationalism and the promised reset, I was of the view that we'll move away from, politicizing such important events in our national discourse and make it, truly worthy of a national celebration. Because indeed and in fact, if you look at the history, the background to all this, it started way, 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 way before President Mahama became president. Like Kwesi said, the Caribbeans have been championing reparatory justice for decades. We in Africa, including civil society organizations, Kwesi himself, have been, advocating for reparatory justice for years.
In fact, he's written a book on that.
His Excellency Nana Addo Dankwa Akufo-Addo is credited to be the one who, initiated the framework on which subsequently President Mahama was appointed as the AU champion.
Right.
And he did this for and on behalf of Ghana and the entire black race. It is worth celebrating. And I'll urge my friends in the NDC to take the politics out and not make it look as if this is some initiative that was dreamt of, conceived, and executed by one individual.
Right.
It's a collective thing that we all must celebrate as Africans. Senior has said a lot, and I agree with him entirely on the issue of the rationale for the Israeli abstention. I found it rather strange because, like he said, there are a hierarchy of crimes. Okay, even the mode of trial itself is suggestive of a clear recognition, and I said inherent in that is a clear recognition of the hierarchy of crimes. You have crimes that are tried summarily, okay, and you have crimes that are tried by indictment. You have crimes that are described as felony, which are more serious as opposed to crimes that are misdemeanors, okay, which are seen to be lesser crimes. And so I think that Africa has won, the world has won. We should celebrate the role that His Excellency the President played. Kudos to him, but give credit where credit is due. I was surprised that an important event like this, all the people who were invited to attend the welcome was his political appointees. Okay, I'm not so sure whether they extended an invitation to anybody else, including civil society, to welcome the president for the feat that he had chalked in leading Africa to attain this feat. Okay, there are things that we can play politics with, and there are things that are Ghanaian, okay, that are national, that we ought to, as much as possible, try to, let it have the national feel and outlook that it's supposed to have. That would be my comments on this for now.
If there are any payments of reparations, you should go to the direct victims as those who were captured and taken out of the continent. If there are to be any reparatory payments, those of us in Africa should not receive it. It is a fact that we participated massively in capturing and selling of the slaves. My view is that compensate Caribbeans, African Americans, and the others. There are efforts.
Well, first, I think there's a certain narrative,
Okay.
which is not absolutely correct.
Right.
And we need to look at it.
Okay.
I mean, this narrative sees the victory as a Ghanaian victory. It even gets worse. Sometimes it's reduced to an NDC victory. And worse still, it is sometimes reduced to a Mahama victory. It is not. To be honest with you, the CARICOM nations were ahead of Africa. The CARICOM nations, the countries of the Caribbean,
Yeah.
have been fighting for reparation for decades. You understand? They had established mechanisms for demanding reparation. They'd gone through the legal processes and so on. So the CARICOM nations were ahead of Africa. So we shouldn't take credit where it belongs to others. The CARICOM nations have been in the lead. You understand? Now, besides, this resolution was actually tabled by President John Dramani Mahama of Ghana on behalf of 55 countries in Africa. 55 countries in Africa. The Caribbean states wholeheartedly, unanimously supported the resolution. So this is a resolution which was put before the UN General Assembly by CARICOM and the African Union. Okay. Our president happened to be the person who moved the resolution. One, because he was appointed, I think, in 2025 as the AU champion for reparations. He became the AU's official spokesperson for reparations. And during his tenure, he's done extremely well. President John Dramani Mahama has done extremely well during his tenure as the AU champion for reparations. There's no doubt at all about it. But we have to appreciate the fact that he was acting on behalf of his colleagues. Indeed, all 55 heads of states could not have proposed this resolution. Only one had to do so. And the one who had to do so was the AU's champion for reparations. And the AU champion for reparations is President John Dramani Mahama. And he's done an excellent job of the task which was assigned to him. Now, I was at home watching television when the voting started. And I saw something I don't think that many people saw it. Cuba was the first country to vote for the resolution.
Interesting.
You know, there's a board on which there's a list of countries. So when the vote is announced, if you press the yes button, it shows green.
Right.
Cuba was the first country which voted and it showed green.
Okay.
Now that is interesting for many reasons. Because Cuba has a huge diasporan population. Cuba has a black population, huge diasporan African population. Indeed, if you go to Cuba, the dominant religion is African traditional religion, which traces its roots to Nigeria and so on. So Cuba has that link, and also the long historical links with Africa, its participation in the national liberation struggle, its lead role in bringing an end to apartheid and so on. So it fitted. So Cuba was the first country, and for me, it was significant. Now, the other thing which was also very significant was the three countries which voted against the resolution.
Yes.
One, let's start with the United States of America. Look, in terms of the stealing of surpluses that were generated with slave labor, the U.S. benefited the most. So if you see reparation as payment, return of resources and so on, the U.S. economy will suffer the most because it is the largest beneficiary of the accumulation and stealing of value which was generated by slave labor and so on. So you can understand that. An aspect of the slave trade also has to do with racism. And racism is almost endemic in the United States of America. You know, in my lifetime, blacks and whites could not take the same buses in the US. In fact, when they could take the same buses, there were places which were reserved for blacks and places reserved for whites. In fact, it took Rosa Parks, a civil rights activist, to protest such that blacks and whites could sit anywhere on a bus. And that's in my lifetime, you understand. The discrimination against Chicanos, Latinos, and Africans in the United States is almost legendary. Look, after Ghana's independence, Kobna Agbele-Gbedema, who was Nkrumah's finance minister, traveled to the United States of America. This after Ghana's independence, mark you, 1957. He was denied access to a cafe because he was black. This is recent. You understand? So it is not surprising to get a country like the United States of America voting against such a resolution, because to vote for such a resolution would amount to self-indictment. So I can understand that. Then there is Israel, which also voted against the resolution. And interestingly, yesterday, France decided that its airspace is not available for the flying of weapons to Israel. It has banned the use of its airspace to supply the Israeli military. France, yesterday. Italy has taken a similar decision, and so on. Many European countries are coming on board, and so on. Now, 2 days ago, Israel passed a law which discriminated blatantly against other nationalities. It passed a law which says that Palestinians which are caught in violent crimes and so on, terrorist activities and so on,
Should be killed.
should be executed
Yes.
by hanging.
Yes.
The whole world is in uproar. The whole world is saying that this is racist.
Yeah.
This is apartheid. The European Union has taken a stand against this. You understand? So a country which is itself racist, in fact, practices the worst form of racism, which is apartheid. The UN yesterday made a statement that the law amounts to apartheid. The UN, okay? The UN Secretary General and so on. So a country which is itself engaged in racist practices, the worst form of racism and so on, cannot be expected to vote for such a resolution. It's clear. I'm not worried. It was expected. Then there is Argentina. Now, if you look at Argentina, you have to look at the population dynamics of Argentina. Argentina was a major beneficiary of slave labor. There were many Africans there. Since the abolition of slave trade, of slavery, since its official abolition, black numbers have been dwindling. To the extent that today, the black population is virtually insignificant in Argentina. Why? There's a deliberate policy of keeping blacks out. Some have even suggested that it is possible that some genocide was carried out against the black population. I don't have the full facts. I won't go there. But if you look at the population dynamics of Argentina, the black population has been reducing drastically, needing some explanation. I'm not surprised that Argentina took that stance. Okay. Then there is the case of the members of the European Union who abstained. And there's an article in the Financial Times written by one of the topmost journalists in the UK and so on, which explains why it was necessary for European Union member states to abstain. In fact, he even argued that they should have voted against the resolution. And he says that, look, if you do the calculation, reparation will cost European countries trillions of euros. And that will lead to the collapse of the economies of the European Union members. So for them, this is what some of them describe as an existential threat to their economies. And they are right. My friend, if you take the Western countries today, there is not one institution which is not thriving. Well, let me put it this way, which is thriving, which is not linked to the slave trade. Not one.
Sure.
The educational institutions, their financial institutions, even their monarchies, and so on. They thrive today because of the stolen wealth of Africa that they sit on. And my brother, I'll give you just a few examples. I think I've even overused this particular example, but I'll use it again.
Right.
If you take Barclays Bank, the resources which went into establishing Barclays Bank came from the slave trade.
Right.
In fact, the Barclay brothers who established Barclays Bank were slave traders. Okay? So that is significant. You want to take the monarchy. Today, King Charles, on his official ceremonies and so on, he rides in a gold chariot, not golden, gold chariot. That gold, where did it come from? I'm sure you know.
Yeah.
Cape Coast. Your place. Cape Coast. It came from Cape Coast. That is the wealth of the African people which was stolen. Of course, you know about these European monarchs, the diamonds in their crowns and so on, where it came from, and so I'm not going to go into that, you know. So they fear that if this reparation movement is carried on beyond a certain extent, their economies are in jeopardy. The very foundations, the surpluses that led to building those economies will be taken away from them. So they're in panic.
Right.
And I can understand that. Finally, my brother, where have we come to? The United Nations General Assembly, representing the world, has, in a significant majority vote, endorsed the position that the transatlantic slave trade is the worst crime against humanity. That's a vindication. That's a major vindication we've been looking for years, which has been denied. We now have it.
The perpetrators disagree.
Well,
The EU says...
They're in a minority. I've already explained that.
The EU says one of the reasons why they abstained was because they do not want to accept that it is the gravest or the worst crime perpetrated against, because there's the Holocaust. For them, the Holocaust is worse than...
I thought that was the Israeli position.
Yeah, that's Israeli and the EU.
Oh, okay.
In fact, they wanted that to be incorporated into the resolution. Yes,
if you would allow.
That's fine. That's
If
fine.
you would allow.
That's fine.
Okay.
I know you get there. I just couldn't read.
If you would allow.
That's fine.
Yeah.
I'll go see. Please go ahead.
You see? Now you make me lose my train. But I'll come back.
Sorry. My apologies.
Don't worry at all.
All right.
You know, one, the argument, the personal resolution which says the transatlantic slave trade is the worst crime against humanity, establish a hierarchy of law.
Yes.
And that is offensive
Yes.
to the general principles of law.
Exactly.
I think it's an illiterate position to take.
Why?
Fortunately for us, we are sitting with a lawyer. And a lawyer of no mean repute.
True.
Is here. So we can examine that, even on the technical basis.
Right.
You see, the law establishes a hierarchy of crimes.
True.
Every law, anywhere, establishes a hierarchy of crimes.
Very inherent.
It's inherent. Thank you, sir. Thank you. Now listen. Why is it that shoplifting carries a sentence which is less than murder? That's a hierarchy.
True.
Misdemeanor against felony.
Yeah.
Exactly. That's a hierarchy.
So it's high crime.
Yes.
Yeah, that's a hierarchy. So that position of the European Union, the United States of America, and Israel collapses. The law establishes a hierarchy all the time.
Okay.
Even the fact that some cases are triable at the magistrate court, and that some cases can only be triable at the high court. You can't take the same cases to the magistrate court, establishes a hierarchy.
True.
So that argument is neither
False
here
fact.
nor there.
Right.
It's useless.
Right.
Now, let's come back to the claim that the Holocaust is the worst crime against humanity. Let's come back to that. The official records I've seen, and it's very well documented in the book I just published,
Yes.
is that at least the least number of Africans who were captured into slavery is 12.6 million. 12.6 million Africans were captured into slavery. The official record says that for every one person who was captured into slavery, 3 others were killed. Because there were wars of capture. There was slave resistance right on our soil, and even on the boats, including one which was named Jesus. One of the slave boats was named Jesus. Do you know that?
Slave boat.
Yeah, was
Jesus.
named Jesus. Yeah, check. Including one of the slave boats which was named Jesus. Okay? So if you do the multiplication, if you do the maths, you're talking about 50 million people who were lost in this madness, in this atrocious crime which was committed against the African people. Compare that to the Holocaust. Just the official maths. There are some estimates which are much bigger than this. So even in terms of the numbers, it is clear. You understand? But then look at the nature of the crime. The nature of the crime. And I'm not absolving Hitler for the crimes he committed against the Jewish people and mankind generally. I'm not. Those were criminal actions who deserve condemnation and so on. The burning of Jews in gas chambers and so on cannot be justified under any circumstance. But in terms of comparison, the crimes which were committed against the African people in the transatlantic slave trade were worse than the sufferings that the Jews had to endure. And please, Google it. You have your machine here. Google it. At a certain stage, the African skin, this, was used in the manufacture of belts and bags. They were considered as high-value fashion items. Did that happen to the Jews? I mean, what crime can be worse than capturing human beings, deskinning them, and using their skins to manufacture bags and belts? Can you imagine? But that happened to the African people. You understand? These were horrendous crimes which were committed against us. We were not treated better than the cows on their farms. You see, if you buy a cow in the market, when the cow gives birth, the calves are yours. You understand? By law, they are yours. When the African slave gave birth, the children did not belong to the African slave. It belonged to the slave owner. That's how we're treated. Like cows, like fowls. That's horrendous crimes, against us, and so on. And I can go on and talk about these crimes and how atrocious these crimes were. The transatlantic slave trade destroyed African science. And I'd like to give you one example of the extent to which they destroyed it. Two, actually.
Yeah.
One.
Okay, so please try and land so that I can bring in
When COVID-19 broke out, the science of vaccines became so important around the world and so. I didn't know before then, but I got to know when COVID-19 broke out that vaccination as a science was developed in West Africa and taken to the United States of America.
Right.
Now, how many African countries are producing vaccines? And even those that are producing vaccines, we have to pay royalty to European companies, to Indian companies, and so on, when the technology originally is African. There is the case of the African woman who was arrested in Elmina and tried in the castle, in the Elmina castle, and subsequently taken to Portugal and so on. What was her crime? She had a sore on her hand, and she used an African balm to cure it. She was accused of witchcraft. So African medical science was seen as witchcraft. They destroyed it. You understand? You should read the papal bull, which was issued by the Pope in 1452, and its content. You should read the law which declared African lands as vacant lands, and so on. So clearly this is the worst crime.
Okay.
But the most important question you've asked is, where do we go from here? There appears to be some confusion between slavery and the transatlantic slave trade.
True.
There appears to be some confusion. And here is the confusion. You see, I am a Marxist, and therefore I see history as a science. The world is defined. You can take the world apart, and also reassemble the world into through the lenses of two sciences, dialectical materialism and historical materialism, and so on. The point I'm making simply is that if you study the evolution of human society, human society started as primitive communal. Okay? And that is why in secondary school, when we're being taught about societies in geography and so on, we're told about the hunter-gatherers society.
Okay.
That is the primitive communal society. Okay. But then it evolved. And then we came to the slave society. And then, of course, to the feudalist society. And the prediction is that from the feudalist society, we went to the capitalist society, and we are likely and most likely to move on to socialist society and so on. So the point I'm saying is that the slave state was a socio-economic formation that every society in the world had to go through. European, Asian, African, Caribbean, whatever, had to go through that stage of development, the slave society. So every society, every people have had slavery at some point. Now, slavery did not die under feudalism. Under feudalism, there were slaves. I mean, if you take the narrative about Western democracy, it talks about Western democracy starting in where? Greece, I suppose.
Yes, Greece.
And so on. Why? At the time that Western democracy was supposed to have started in Greece, were there not slaves? Did the slaves have votes? They didn't. That was a defect, and so on. So we should not confuse slavery, which is universal, to the transatlantic slave trade. That confusion exists. Okay. Now, besides that, we are told that we participated in it. We were beneficiaries of it. Show me what in Africa you can point to as a benefit from the transatlantic slave trade. That's nothing. Okay? Nothing. We are still immersed in the quagmire of poverty and underdevelopment. There's nothing here. All the benefits can be found in Western Europe. All the benefits can be found in America. How come that we participated in it equally, and yet we don't have any of the benefits? How come? Somebody must explain that. Okay. Besides, today, we talk about the return of artifacts. When we are talking about the return of artifacts, it includes the heads of African leaders. It includes the bodies of African leaders. Those heads, who did they belong to? Those heads belong to African heroes who resisted the transatlantic slave trade, who were captured and beheaded, and their heads were sent to Europe to be displayed. If I tell you. So those people who were beheaded and their heads were taken to Europe to be displayed in museums and so on, were they accomplices? They resisted it. Go back to the history of Yasantwa. The Yasantwa War, what was it about? And so, you understand? So we have to have a correct reading of history. Yes, it is true that the European armies, which went into the hinterland to capture slaves and so on, leading to the death of more than 50 million people in Africa, had African assistants. There were some Africans who served as guides, some Africans who actually even served as soldiers. But they themselves were victims. They themselves were victims. They were not accomplices. Did they benefit from it? They didn't benefit from it. Okay? So this is the argument which has been sold to us in order to minimize guilt, the guilt of the perpetrators and so on. And then, my brother, Moro.
Yes, sir.
You and I went to Ghanaian schools.
Yes.
In fact, my brother Ejapa also went to Ghanaian schools.
Yes.
Right from day nursery, we are indoctrinated to accept our guilt. Okay? To the extent that in secondary school, we were writing exams and which asked us to discuss the positive sides of the slave trade.
Sure.
You were asked questions like, what were the positive and negative effects of colonialism and so on. So that is how we have grown up.
Yeah.
We've grown up completely confused. You understand? We've grown up with garbage in our heads, garbage which the colonialists, which the enslavers put in our heads.
Okay.
Nowhere in our history lessons did we learn that the whole of the Congo was the personal property of the King of Belgium. Did you learn that at school?
No.
You learned that after school.
Yes.
Okay?
Yes.
And that the King of Belgium transformed the whole of the Congo into his machine for extracting African wealth. And that every Congolese was required to supply a certain quantity of rubber. And if you supplied rubber which was below that quantity, your hand was amputated.
Okay.
How is the Congolese complicit in this?
Right.
You understand?
Okay.
And then there's some more confusion. The confusion that reparation is about the payment of monetary compensation.
Yeah, you said the record straight on that already. You
Well,
said the record. You said
no
it from the
amount of money can
Yes.
pay for the crimes which
I
were
agree with
committed against us.
I agree with you.
Reparation actually in its full meaning is resetting the world.
Yeah.
Resetting the world and its institutions.
Right.
You understand?
Okay.
Repairing the damage which was done in Berlin in 1884 when Otto von Bismarck invited his fellow leaders in Western Europe to divide Africa into their spheres of influence. There was no African at the table.
Right.
You understand?
Okay.
These are the things that reparation is about.
Okay.
Reparation is about the restoration of African spirituality.
All right.
Reparation is about the restoration of African dignity and so on.
All right. All right. So
Dedi kama mamena PENDREAM TV ase. Na so far so good. Say open online portal e wo Ghana. Ah nipa share, nipa follow, nipa comment here. To my best of knowledge, without any biases, PENDREAM TV.